I love this line. You say, in the poem, I get drunk.
I try to. Emily Dickinson said, art is a house that wants to be haunted, right? And so maybe I write poems that want to be drunk, and sometimes maybe they are.
How do you stay drunk in the poem and sober in the editing room?
That I'm always trying to explain this to my students, you know, that very first rush of creative energy. Well, at that point, of course, you don't edit yourself. You don't try to stop, and it's wonderful when it happens. Then you very often set it aside for a while, and sometimes it might be quite a while. When you come back to it, you look at it as I call the stranger reader. The stranger reader is a person who's not your boyfriend, not your girlfriend, not your mother. It's somebody who doesn't know you and frankly doesn't give a damn about you. They don't know you. This person loves poetry and they have one intention: to find a really good poem that speaks to them. They don't care what the troubles are in your life.
Yeah.
And that is who you are writing for. And so you distance yourself. And you have to have the tools, and that's what workshops are about. They're about giving you this criteria so that when you go back to that poem and you are now the stranger reader, you're going, and I think in terms of impact, what creates the impact? And it has to do with the opening line. The opening, it's really important, because I always say to my students, that sets the standard or sets the bar. If you bring an exciting, dynamic language and a voice, the beginnings of a voice that is talking to us, and you set your poem there, you will not then want to fall, almost naturally without thinking about it, you will not want to fall below that level. One of the things that matters to me, that I think is a kind of touchstone for me, is the idea of impact. In order to create that impact, and by that I mean, I can mean I can mean several things. I can mean a poem that sort of grows on you and then coalesces at the end in some final sort of culmination that pulls together all the different little elements of the poem and then sort of explodes in implication and meaning. And I use the word implication because sometimes you cannot pin down the meaning, but there's implications. The other thing that I find impacting is poetry, as you say, that has mood and atmosphere, and the way that comes over you, and the way that affects you like kind of an ether, and the way that pulls you down into a deep, almost nameless place, puts you in an environment and puts you in a situation, but also sets you in a certain mood. And it's one of the things that I love about noir, about film noir, especially when it works, those black and white movies, and how they create a sense of, well, it's really it's the poetry of the city, but it's the poetry of the underworld of the city, of the back alleys, of the six-story apartment houses with the fire escapes going up the side. And in poetry, how you do that, I guess first of all, you find that in yourself. You find that mood in yourself. So then maybe that poem comes out of a mood rather than an emotion. So rather than coming out of joy or something like that, it comes out of maybe a sense, a slight flavoring of menace. I wrote my first poem in Mexico, and I was not quite yet 9. I knew about poetry because my parents had given me a wonderful book called Children's Poems Old and New, and I wrote a little poem. It rhymed. Now, in the 6th grade, I looked at it again and I went, this is such a forced rhyme. And it's almost as important, the fact that I made my first revision when I was, I guess I would have been 10 or something like that, as what that I wrote, because a lot of people write as kids, you know, but how many kids revise, edit, and go, this rhyme is just, what is a raccoon doing in this poem set in Mexico about the moon?
From that moment, you had this self-image of you as a poet since that day, that night in Mexico?
Yeah.
Wow.
I thought I was a poet. When I was 17, I just heard a conversation and picked up the idea that there was a great poet named T.S. Eliot, and I had a few bucks, and I went, well, I want to go read this great poet, see if he's as great as everybody thinks he is. Maybe he's not. And I read The Love Song of J.L. Prufrock and The Wasteland when I was 17, which nothing had prepared me for, not my high school classes or anything had prepared me for that. And I had that experience where I went, oh my, would say nowadays, just, oh my God, OMG.
You studied with Peter
Everwine, right?
Yes, with
and
Mark Strand.
With Mark Strand for one quarter down at Irvine.
And also with Ingrid
Salisbury.
Yes.
It was now Ingrid Wendt. And Philip Lummis, very large in my life. I think all of them in their own way, and certainly Phil, I think gave me a sense, which he got from John Berryman. He studied with John Berryman, who was one of the great masters, teachers of the mid-20th century. A certain moral obligation that the poet has. I mean, you're not just out there to make something pretty that opens and closes like a little music box. The poet has a larger responsibility in the world, and it's to tell the truth. It doesn't necessarily mean directly be a social, political poet protesting and
or the historical truth. It's more than that.
It's the truth of the world around us, and telling that truth in a different kind of penetrating way.
I have a couple of definitions here. I think they're good definitions. One says, because you are the inventor of the poem noir, one says, is poetry that evokes stark urban landscapes and atmospheres. And the other definition is
the fusion of urban grit with urbane wit. Yeah, and I would just say that there are some other people, such as David Lehman in New York, who have also pursued an interest in this, and he's actually written some essays about his own explorations trying to figure out what this is. But on the West Coast, I'm the woman. For me, it has something to do with the fact that I've actually been a victim of street crime, including having a gun held to my head, which I always say doesn't make me a better writer of the poem noir, but it sure as hell gives me a certain authority.
So what's the biggest change or that you have seen through the years?
It was 79 when I got here, and there was very little going on in the terms of workshops and teachers. And then sometime during the 80s, I think people like David St. John and maybe Gail Ronsky might have come around that time, I'm not sure, and it just kept. So yeah, the quality of the work is now we're a world-class city in terms of quality of poetry. Here in LA, I think there's two things that I notice here, and one is irreverence.
Irreverence?
Irreverence, because we've been marginalized. I guess that's a fashionable term, but it still works. You have to, one line of defense, emotional psychic defense, is develop a sense of humor about your situation. So there's irreverence here in the poetry. And the other, I think, you know what I think it is? Reverence, actually. I'm sometimes surprised at how often in the poetry of Los Angeles there is a spiritual quest, a quest for what is the spiritual in the midst of this environment. And when you think about it, it makes a certain sense. If everything is about the mini mall and the strip mall and being stuck on the 101 freeway at 6 o'clock and the corporate high rises, and then what is the spiritual here? And I think it takes a lot of different forms.
What would you like to see more in the poetry monde in Los Angeles?
I can tell. There's not enough intellectual dialogue about issues that are important to poets. Not enough literary criticism, poetry criticism. And by criticism, I mean a discussion of the poet's work. What is this poet doing? What I care about right now, what is interesting to me, is bringing poets together with people of the other arts, with visual artists, and just with interesting intellectuals. I would love to know what Ed Ruscha thinks about poetry. Great painter, important painter. He's here in LA, and I would love to know how painters read poetry, maybe because they're so visual, they see it differently. I've worked with people in dance. Stephen Koplowitz, who is the Dean of Dance over at Cal Arts, and he commissioned me to write some poems that would fit in with his exploration of water in Los Angeles.